Professor McGrath, welcome on stage.
Welcome, welcome. We are glad to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, and I'm doing even better now I'm here.
Oh, that's very nice. How has Finland been treating you?
Well, there's less snow than I expected.
Yeah, if you had come here last Friday, there would have been quite much snow.
Yes, it's surprising even to us that there's less snow now. So you have been teaching at Oxford University for a long time as a professor of science and religion. In that time, have you noticed any change in the atmosphere among the students when it comes to attitude towards Christianity?
I think I've noticed two. One is that increasingly we have a number of students who are committed Christians and want to think through their faith, but we're also seeing an increased number of students who are not Christians but are interested in Christianity and are therefore studying theology not because at the moment they see it as being life-changing, but because they see it as being interesting. They want to know more about it. So we have this interplay between a committed group of students and an interesting group of students who want to explore it rather than as others who want to go deeper.
That sounds very interesting. So the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. I've been very much looking forward to this and talking about C.S. Lewis on miracles. And the question I've been asked to engage is whether this is still relevant for intellectuals, but also for people in the pews. In other words, for ordinary Christian believers. I've been speaking from the wrong podium. But I'm still going to say the same thing. So the question I've been asked to talk about is C.S. Lewis on Miracles, a book written in 1947. Is it still relevant for intellectuals? Is it still relevant for people in the pews, for ordinary Christians? And what I want to say is that the issues that Lewis is engaging are indeed academically relevant, but also, I think, very important for ordinary people. And in particular, I hope to draw out for you this afternoon the real interest Lewis has in rejecting the idea of what you might call naturalism. That is to say that reality is limited to this material world, that there is nothing behind or beyond this world. And for Lewis, that is a very significant theme, that in effect, everything in this world, according to Lewis, points to something beyond it. And as you will know, Lewis is a very able Christian apologist, but he does not limit himself to the rational defense of the Christian faith. In many ways, what Lewis is doing is drawing an argument which appeals to the imagination, to the emotions, to human desires. Lewis has this very famous argument that, in effect, our desires suggest that we are created for a bigger world than the material order is able to disclose. In other words, our sense that there is something bigger and better than this world is an indication that materialism is simply not adequate as a description of reality, and certainly not adequate as an account of what kind of world we inhabit and what you and I are meant to be and are meant to discover in this life. So Lewis, I think, is inviting us to go beyond a purely rational approach to thinking about the world, to in effect draw on our imaginations, to draw on stories, to draw on our feelings, and weave all of these together into a coherent and comprehensive account of the Christian faith. But this book, Miracles, I think, does play a very significant role in Lewis's own articulation of the Christian faith. And I'm going to draw on a sermon that Lewis delivered at Oxford in 1941. And this sermon is called The Weight of Glory. And in this sermon, Lewis talks about a richer vision of reality, a deeper understanding of who we are and what this world is. And Lewis says that we need to break the spell that materialism has had on our culture. In other words, that we are being blinded to this bigger vision of reality. And Lewis is saying that what we need to do is to break this spell that materialism holds upon us. How do we do it? Lewis's answer is that to break the spell of materialism, we need to tell a better story, to give a bigger, better, more attractive vision of reality, which shows up the inadequacy of a purely materialist view of the world. And that is what Lewis does in this 1947 book, Miracles. So I want to talk you through some of the main arguments that Lewis develops. And then, because I think the whole question of materialism is so important, we'll also look at some more recent contributions to that discussion. But certainly I want to focus on this book, Miracles, because it's very significant to Lewis in a number of ways. So let's begin by looking at what Lewis has to say. Lewis argues that very often arguments against miracles are not really arguments. They're simply reassertions of a naturalist or materialist position, as if this is self-evidently true. And Lewis writes these words: "If naturalism is true, then," I quote, "we know in advance that miracles are impossible, that nothing can come into nature from the outside, because there is nothing outside to come in." So Lewis is really saying that very often miracles are dismissed from the outset on the basis of the assumption, the controlling assumption, that we are talking about materialism or naturalism, which simply discredits the idea of the miraculous. Now, Lewis, in Miracles, begins to explore the regularities of the natural world and says some very nice things about the ability of the natural sciences to be able to represent this. But Lewis, in many ways, is drawing a distinction, which I think is very important here, which is if you like, the laws of nature as a description of what we observe about nature, a description of what we observe about nature which may change over time, and then the laws of nature as, in effect, a prescription. This is what happens. This is what only can happen. In other words, the laws of nature are seen as regulating what happens in the world. And Lewis is moving us towards the idea that the laws of nature are best seen as a description of what we observe in the world without in any way eliminating the idea of special divine action, the idea of the miraculous. And that, I think, is a very interesting position, and it is, I think, well worth looking at. Why does Lewis think this question is so important? Well, Lewis's argument is that the category of the miraculous is really important for Christianity. And some of you may know a sermon he preached in 1945, which is usually titled "The Grand Miracle." And his argument here is that Christianity is all about something that is remarkable, that is exciting, that is ultimately miraculous. Let me read to you a line from that sermon, which I think will give you an indication of both what he thinks and why he thinks this is so important. "The Christian story," he writes, "is precisely the story of one grand miracle. The Christian assertion that what is beyond all space and time, what is uncreated, eternal, came into nature, descended into his own universe, and rose again, bringing nature up with him." And for Lewis, Christianity affirms that the natural order is porous, it's receptive to the activity and the presence of God. And that general principle leads Lewis to not merely insist on the validity of miracles, but also to point out that Christianity challenges both the intellectual legitimacy, but also the existential adequacy of a naturalist worldview. For Lewis, we need more than this if we are going to live authentic lives. And that for Lewis is a very important point. So let's begin then by looking at Lewis's argument about the nature of a miracle. For Lewis, the word miracle does not refer to a simple observation. Something happens and we say that's miraculous. Lewis is saying that we need to have a frame, a worldview, something which means we look at an observation and interpret it and say that shouldn't be happening, therefore it is miraculous. So if you like, it's both an observation of what we see, but also an interpretation, a recognition that this is something extraordinary and therefore points to something that is really significant. And Lewis argues that if we're locked into a mindset that excludes the miraculous as a matter of principle, then it follows that miracles simply cannot happen. And one of the things that Lewis is saying in miracles is we need to expand our vision of the natural world to ensure that we do not close down this discussion in advance by defining nature in terms that simply exclude from the outset this idea of miracles. For Lewis, the question of whether miracles can occur cannot be answered by experience. We need to look at this idea of miracles in more detail. Here's what Lewis says. Nothing can seem extraordinary until you've discovered what is ordinary. Belief in miracles, far from depending on ignorance of the laws of nature, is only possible insofar as those laws are known. Now that, I think, is an important point. What alerts us to saying this event, this observation stands out as being distinctive, as being unusual, as being miraculous. So Lewis is saying we need to begin with an understanding of what is normal, what is the normal course of events. But Lewis argues that whether we're talking about something that's ordinary or extraordinary, the fundamental characteristic of a miracle is that it's an interference with nature by a supernatural power. So obviously this will raise some questions for us. And as you might expect, Lewis identifies what those questions are and begins to help us to answer them. As I read those words, some of you will say, Lewis is heading straight into a trap that is laid by the British philosopher David Hume. Let me read you Lewis's words again. A miracle is an interference with nature by a supernatural power. And David Hume, of course, as you will know, spoke of miracles as something that violates the laws of nature. And I want to look at that idea in more detail because it is something that is really significant. But let me begin by just adding to what Lewis said. Lewis wants to argue that there is a harmony within the universe, and within this overall harmony, we can find room for what we describe as miracles. He wants to make the point that the universe is only partially accessible to science, and there will always be things that lie beyond the reach of science. We need to be aware of this. And we also, I think Lewis says, need to be aware of the fact that Christianity is giving us a big picture of the world which goes beyond a description simply of the physical order, but also relates to us as living individuals. And here's a quote from Miracles I think many of you will know. In science, we've been reading only the notes to a poem. In Christianity, we find the poem itself. So Lewis is trying to make the point that we need to be aware that naturalism is the assumption that we very often bring to this discussion, and that this assumption does really need to be challenged. So what Lewis is doing here is to try and make the point that a miracle is a defensible category. Lewis writes, the possibility of miracles cannot be disproven, and I think we'll all feel we want to go further than that. But certainly Lewis begins by affirming that miracles is a defensible category, and he wants to invite his skeptical readers to step into his own way of seeing things and assess the plausibility of miracles from this viewpoint. In other words, Lewis is saying maybe there are other ways of looking at this other than from a naturalist perspective. But Lewis himself will also bring to bear some other criteria on this question, and I want to look at some of those issues. So let me begin, if I may, by looking at alternatives approaches. Let's begin by looking at David Hume's discussion of miracles, which in many ways is the backdrop to what Lewis is saying. David Hume defined a miracle in terms of it being something that is, and I quote, a violation of the laws of nature, or a transgression of the laws of nature by God. And clearly, the question we have to look at here is where this idea of a law of nature actually comes from. And there are philosophical and there are historical issues that we're going to need to look at here. And one of the points I want to make is that actually we are dealing with the absolutization of certain principles into laws of nature, a development which took place in the late 17th century. And the question is whether this is a legitimate development or whether it is going beyond the available evidence. So let's begin to look at some of these questions. David Hume's discussion of miracles is interesting. Hume, I think, makes it very, very difficult to actually define a miracle, because if you think about the way in which Hume understands how we can investigate the natural order, Hume's argument is that we depend on induction. We observe this and this and this, and then we have to induce that this will happen as a result of those. In other words, we observe nature and we infer that it has this uniformity, and therefore that this uniformity can be expected to continue, and therefore we infer that what happened today in this situation is what will happen in the future in this same situation. And many observers have made the entirely reasonable point that actually it is not that straightforward, that actually we do not know that nature is uniform in terms of what happens. We have to believe that, and there are real problems with Hume's inductive approach. And so the concern that would be expressed about Hume's critique of miracles is, what happens if what up to this point seems to be absolutely regular is then violated through some new discovery, which means we have to rethink things. And many of you will know that in the 20th century, there have been a whole series of events taking place in what had been assumed to be an unproblematic set of assumptions about the natural world are called into question by new evidence which doesn't fit existing paradigms and thus forces us to rethink things. For Hume, inductive generalizations are necessarily incomplete, and that means that we can't think of them as being proved or universal. The advance of science inevitably entails the review and sometimes the revision of what previous generations regarded as being firmly established. So the key point I want to make is that Hume's inductive method is simply not capable of establishing unbreakable laws of nature. It simply identifies some general patterns of behavior concerning what is observed to happen, which then makes us think these things ought to happen in the future. but it doesn't enable normative judgments about what can and what cannot happen. In other words, laws of nature are a description of regularities observed up to this point, but it does not mean that those are prescribed for the future. Now, I'd say something here about the Dutch philosopher Spinoza. Spinoza, in the view of many historians, is the philosopher who's responsible for this absolutization of the laws of nature. Previously, as historians like Peter Harrison have pointed out, laws of nature were seen as reliable descriptions of the patterns that we observe in nature, leading us to ask the question, what lies behind these patterns that we can observe? And for many 17th century scientists and theologians, what lay behind these patterns was an ordered natural world established by God in the act of creation. But the Jewish philosopher Spinoza took this idea of laws of nature further. And instead of seeing them as descriptions of what happened, they were seen as rules for what could happen. In other words, this is the way in which the natural world ought to take place. These are laws that cannot be broken. And that really is the backdrop to Hume's description of what a miracle is. Peter Harrison, I mentioned a moment ago, an Australian intellectual historian, and he's pointed out something which I think is really interesting, looking at the period in which David Hume was writing. And Harrison points out that leading scientists of this period, almost without exception, had a double commitment. A commitment to natural science based on a regular universe governed by laws of nature, but on the other hand, to an omnipotent God who was able to intervene in the natural order from time to time, thus breaching these laws of nature in the course of carrying out the work of redemption. Here's an example of one of those writers. This is the British natural philosopher, Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle wrote these words: God established laws of nature, but, I quote, he has not bound up his own hands by them, but can invigorate, suspend, overrule, and reverse any of them as he sees fit. Now, the key point being made here by Boyle is that as God established these rules to express God's own nature, why should not God feel able to override these in order to bring about certain things that God wanted to happen? So that is a very important point to make, and Lewis draws on this in the course of his book Miracles. But Lewis is also reflecting an awareness that there are different ways of defining miracle. David Hume defines a miracle in terms of the violation of the laws of nature, but other definitions are available. Here's Thomas Aquinas writing in the 13th century. And he describes miracles as something, and I quote, that surpasses the capabilities of nature. Again, a miracle is something that surpasses the capabilities of nature. Now, you'll notice there's no reference there to breaking laws of nature. It's simply saying that a miracle is something that enables or expresses nature going beyond its present limits. And again, you can see that as being quite an interesting way of thinking about miracles. Pope Benedict XIV in 1738 described a miracle as an event whose occurrence exceeds the power of nature. And that, I think, is a really important point to make. So in beginning to respond to Hume, I think I need to note how we are really confronted here with an issue of definition. What do we mean by a miracle? For example, the philosopher J.L. Mackie describes a miracle as occurring, I quote, when the world is not left to itself, when something distinct from the natural order as a whole intrudes into it. And so we have the idea here that a miracle is an intervention into the created order from outside the created order. But Lewis will argue, following Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century, that the created order is so connected with and dependent upon God that talking about God intervening in the natural order doesn't make all that much sense. God created this natural order. God is present within this natural order already. That's a very important point. So why are we talking about God intervening? Surely it's simply God operating in a distinctive way inside the natural order. For Augustine, God is already present within the natural order. He established it in the first place, and he uses it to work out our salvation in the second. So I think there's a very important point here to make in thinking about this. Because for Lewis, the incarnation is indeed a grand miracle. But if you think about Lewis's framework, it is about God being present within the natural order and working out our salvation within the natural order through Christ entering into this world and redeeming us within this world. And Lewis's point is that both miracles and the act of redemption are not the act of a God who steps inside our world from outside it, but rather God is already here within that world and is operating in a different way in miracles and in the work of redemption. So let me go back to Peter Harrison. Peter Harrison is one of the scholars who spent a lot of time looking at where this idea of laws of nature comes from and how it has been understood. And he has made the point, I think, very well, that that this idea of an unbreakable law of nature is a relatively recent invention. And if we therefore step back into an earlier period of Christian history, into the Middle Ages, into early Christian thinking, we do not find this obsession with an idea of laws of nature, which are somehow laid down as being unbreakable. Rather, there's a sort of recognition, even an anticipation, that God is going to act in ways that might appear to break these laws of nature, but in reality is simply God exercising his own nature in ways that are completely consistent with God's purpose. So there is no violation here. There's simply God acting in ways that are appropriate for the governing of this universe and for the achievement of human redemption. So I think there is a different way of looking at this. So let's come back then to this idea that there are these laws of nature, which we can know and therefore say these are breached by what appears to be a miracle. I'm going to talk about the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, and I'm going to in particular draw on his 1912 work, The Problems of Philosophy. And I think Russell basically gives a philosophical framework that is quite helpful in dealing with the issues raised by Lewis in Miracles. Bertrand Russell notes that the scientific enterprise depends on certain assumptions that we have to assume, but actually are very, very difficult to justify. And the essential difficulty that Russell notes is that the scientific method has to assume the uniformity of nature in order to proceed with its own distinct methods, but it can't itself substantiate this implicit assumption. Here's what Russell has to say. The belief in the uniformity of nature is the belief that everything that has happened or will happen is an instance of some general law to which there are no exceptions. But Russell asks, what are the grounds of this belief? And his answer, I think, is very significant. The point he makes is that science may and does uncover regularities and uniformities in the natural world. but that these past patterns of regularity cannot be regarded as leading to any degree of certainty. And Russell makes this point using a memorable analogy. And the analogy concerns a man who keeps chickens. I'll read you what Russell has to say. The man who has fed the chicken every day throughout its life wrings its neck instead, showing that more refined views as to the uniformity of nature would have been useful to the chicken. Now, what Russell is saying in this analogy is, imagine a man who keeps chickens, and every day he feeds them, makes sure they're all right, and then one day he kills them because he wants to use them for food. And the point is that the pattern of regularity is suddenly broken. And Russell is asking, where does our belief that this uniformity is there actually come from? For Russell, the key point is that the inductive principle on which human depends is, and I quote, incapable of being proved by an appeal to experience. Now, if you're a natural scientist, you will know how natural scientists cope with this problem. They will say, well, we realize that, but actually this seems to work pretty well, so we'll just keep on using it, even though we recognize that actually it can't be proved to be right. But for our purposes in this lecture, it is important, because it brings out this point that Lewis is trying to make, which is that our suspicion of miracles is actually dependent on prior assumptions about the absolute uniformity of nature, which we cannot prove to be true, and which actually various approaches to a Christian doctrine of creation would suggest is not right in the first place. Russell himself makes the point that the idea of the uniformity of nature is actually circular. He writes these words, "The principle itself cannot, without circularity, be inferred from observed uniformities, since it is required to justify any such regularity." So I think you can see the point that really is there in Lewis's analysis. What might have been seen as a law of nature in one generation can easily be abandoned by a later generation in the light of new evidence or changing theoretical frameworks. In other words, laws of nature have changed both in terms of their status, but also in terms of what we actually think they are over time. Those of you who are theoretical physicists will know the idea of quantum entanglement, which is basically the idea that a quantum event at one end of the universe can in some way interfere with one at the other end. It's deeply counterintuitive, but that seems to be the way the theories are going. So Lewis, I think, is just asking us to critique what we assume to be inevitable, what we assume to be obvious. That in effect we have bought into an early modern way of understanding our universe. And we need to be aware that there are other options that are available. Hume's definition of a miracle, I'm afraid, simply locks us into what one age or generation regarded as self-evidently true assumptions about the natural world. So let me turn to a later work on miracles by the British philosopher F.R. Tennant. And this is a book published in 1925 with the title Miracle and Its Philosophical Presuppositions. And in this book, he makes this very interesting statement, which I think is really interesting. He writes, "Until we shall have arrived at something like omniscience as to nature's constitution and intrinsic capacities, we cannot affirm any marvel to lie beyond them." I will say that again. Until we shall have arrived at something like omniscience as to nature's constitution and intrinsic capacities, we cannot affirm any marvel to lie beyond them. In other words, picking up a theme we find in Augustine in the 5th century and hinted at in Lewis in his 1947 work, Tennant is simply saying, until we have a total understanding of how this universe functions, we simply cannot rule out anything as being impossible. We cannot exclude the category of the miraculous, because in many ways nature is about things happening, miracles are things that happen in nature which we can't really explain. So there is there, I think, a very interesting point. Tennant reminds us that we don't know everything about how the processes of nature work. Augustine, as I mentioned earlier, had argued that a miracle should be understood as something strange and difficult that exceeds the expectation and capacity of anyone who marvels at it. But the key question is, where do we get these expectations from? So Augustine, I think, is witness to an earlier way of thinking about miracles. And in many ways, Augustine talks about a miracle as something that is, as I said, strange and difficult, which exceeds the expectation and capacity of anyone who marvels at it. But the real issue is, I think, that Lewis, in talking about miracles, wants us to do some history and not simply philosophy. If we look at Lewis's well-known book, The Discarded Image, Lewis argues that we've replaced an older understanding of our universe with an essentially mechanical understanding of what the universe is all about. And this, Lewis argues, excludes the notion of the transcendent. It's simply about the universe as a machine, which in effect behaves in certain predictable ways. And what I think is interesting is that Lewis talks about miracles as recognizing that our world is more complex, that things may happen which we are unable to predict, and which in effect in doing so disclose both the complexity of the world but also the ability of God to make himself known in certain ways. And Lewis is interesting because miracles is not simply about a revalidation of the category of the miracle. He's also wanting to re-establish the category of the transcendent. Lewis is really worried that trends in modern philosophy, in modern science, don't simply eliminate God, they also eliminate any sense of transcendence from our understanding of the world. And those of you who've read his 1943 book, The Abolition of Man, will be aware that one of Lewis's core arguments in that book is that the educational methods of England in the 1940s, in effect, presupposed a philosophical naturalism which left no space for the transcendence. And in many ways, Lewis argues for the need to break free from this. Now, as I've been talking, you'll probably have noticed how many works by Lewis written during the 1940s I've mentioned. Miracles is a good example. The sermon, The Weight of Glory, The Abolition of Man, The Grand Miracle, these all date from the same period in Lewis's career when he was very concerned about the re-establishment of a richer understanding of nature within which God was present and free to operate. And that, I think, is something very significant. Lewis, I think, is interesting here because the philosophy of science has undergone some significant changes since the 1940s. And I would argue that it's now much more receptive to Lewis's position. And contemporary debates about the laws of nature have really moved beyond Hume's rather limited notion, which is all too easily linked with the determinist metaphysics. And I think, we see a much greater receptivity towards things happening that don't fit with the laws of nature, and therefore invite us to think, what do these mean? What are their significance? In a recent article, Max Kistler, and the article is entitled Laws of Nature, Exceptions and Tropes, makes a very important point. He says, the validity of most laws, even of a fundamental kind, is incompatible with the existence of exceptional situations. So Lewis, I think, is creating space for the idea of miracles, for things to happen which suggest not simply that nature is not completely predictable, but which open the possibility for saying some of these things that are happening are themselves indicative of the existence and activity of God. But I want to make a point now which Lewis doesn't make, but which is, I think, important to our reflection. And this point was made by Isaac Newton back in the 17th century. And Newton asks this hypothetical question. What happens if something that is miraculous, in other words, that involves going beyond the capacity of nature to do something, happens, and happens so often that we regard it as being normal? And the point that Newton is making, based on his own astronomical reflections, is that actually our universe is remarkable. It's astonishing. And it exceeds our capacity really to understand why it happens in this way. And the point that Lewis is making is that maybe the miraculous happens all around us. You know, seeds grow, the universe behaves in certain ways, and we've just got so used to this that we take it for granted. And I think there is an important point there. But let me now, if I may, bring this lecture to a close. I'm going to do so by just reflecting on a few themes that emerge from this. One is raised by Charles Taylor's excellent book, A Secular Age, in which he reflects on a number of topics, and one of them is why today do we take as self-evident certain assumptions which certainly would have not have been so in the past and might not be so in the future. And one of the points that Charles Taylor is making is that we very often have this idea of our universe as a closed system, which is subject to these laws of nature. And Taylor's point is that actually these assumptions have a history. And these assumptions cannot be assumed to be permanent. They are phases we are going through at the moment, and we are not sure what lies there in the present. And that, I think, is something really important to reflect on. That in effect, in dealing with Lewis's miracles, we're looking at from our position in time and space, and maybe in 100 years, people will look back on this controversy and see it in a very different way. But let me now end by reflecting with you on one point that emerges from Lewis's famous book, Miracles. And many of you will know that the arguments of this book were disputed by Elizabeth Anscombe, a young woman philosopher at Oxford, who, along with Mary Midgley, Iris Murdoch, and Mary Warnock, actually brought about philosophical revival and really re-established the position of women philosophers in England around that time. And Anscombe was very critical of Lewis's argument and said there were several steps in his argument that were missing. She agreed with Lewis's critique of naturalism. She agreed with his re-establishment of the category of miracle, but she felt there were some steps missing. And Lewis seems to have been slightly thrown by this critique. And one suggestion is that because of this embarrassment, Lewis then turned away from philosophical argumentation to writing fiction, like, for example, the Chronicles of Narnia. It's an interesting idea, but I don't think it's really true, because Lewis keeps developing his philosophical argumentation even in his later works. So let me wrap up, because I want to give us plenty of time to talk about Lewis, about miracles, about, wherever you want to take our conversation. I'm very happy to be led by you in any directions we move in. But let me summarize. Lewis's book, Miracles, I think is very helpful. It does not sort out everything, but it does raise some very interesting possibilities. And more recent writers on themes of miracles, like Keith Ward in England or Wolfhard Pannenberg in Germany, do pick up on themes that either are explicitly stated by Lewis or hinted at in developing their general point that God must be able to act in ways that are completely consistent with his purposes as creator and redeemer, and above all, that God's creation of the present natural order does not prevent God in acting in ways that are appropriate for God in the greater work of redemption, and therefore that there is a place for the category of a miracle. So I think Lewis has begun a very interesting discussion, and I'm very grateful to be able to have spoken to you this afternoon on this theme, and I'm now very happy just to let this conversation go in whatever direction we like. Thank you very much indeed for listening.